The detective who arrested me had known my family for 11 years. He'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner at our house twice. And when he read me my rights in the parking lot of the store my grandfather built with his own hands, he wouldn't look me in the eye, because some small, uncomfortable part of him already knew what it would take the rest of us 6 years to find out, that the person who called the police that night, the person who handed over the evidence, the person who cried the hardest in the courtroom gallery, was the one who'd actually done it. My own brother stood 8 feet away from me while I was handcuffed, and he did not say a single word to stop it. 6 years later, a server nobody remembered existed coughed up 11 minutes of footage that changed everything, and this time, when the police came for someone, it wasn't me they were looking for. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time, where we believe that the truth doesn't answer to anyone's timeline but its own, and that patience, however unfair it feels while you're living inside it, is very rarely wasted. If you have ever been punished for something you didn't do, if you've ever watched someone you loved let a lie stand because the lie was more convenient for them than the truth was, I want you to stay with me for this one, because I promise you, it gets its reckoning. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life I've worked in digital forensics, the specific, unglamorous corner of the tech world where people like me get called in after something has already gone wrong, a data breach, a fraud case, a server nobody backed up properly, to figure out exactly what happened and when. It's precise work. It's patient work. And I didn't choose it by accident. I chose it because 6 years before I ever sat for my first certification exam, I learned the hardest way possible what it costs a person when nobody bothers to look at the evidence closely enough. I grew up in a town about 40 minutes outside Columbus, the kind of place where my grandfather's hardware store had been open long enough that 3 generations of the same families walked through its doors. Bennett's Hardware wasn't just where we worked. It was, in the specific way small family businesses become woven into a family's identity, who we were. My grandfather built it from a single rented storefront in the 60s. My father inherited it, expanded it into the mid-sized operation it became, with a second location he opened when I was in high school. And by the time I was in my mid-20s, it was understood, quietly and without much discussion, that my older brother Ryan and I would be the ones to eventually take it over. Ryan is 3 years older than me, and for the entirety of our childhood, he was the golden one, in the specific way firstborn sons sometimes are in families like ours. He was charming, easily likable, the kind of person adults trusted instantly and completely, in a way that had very little to do with whether that trust was actually earned. I loved him. I want to be honest about that from the start, because this isn't a story where I'm going to pretend I saw the whole picture of who he was from the beginning. I loved my brother, uncomplicatedly, for most of my life, in the specific way you love someone simply because they've always been there. We both went to work at the store full-time in our 20s, Ryan managing the second location my father had opened, and me running operations at the original store, the one my grandfather built, handling inventory, payroll, and eventually, as my father started stepping back, most of the store's financial oversight. I was good at it. I liked the precision of it, the specific satisfaction of a ledger that balanced, of systems that worked the way they were supposed to. My father used to joke that I had my grandfather's head for numbers and Ryan had his father's head for people, and for a long time, that felt like a compliment to both of us rather than the quiet dividing line it eventually became. What I didn't know, for most of those years, was that Ryan had built a second life running parallel to the one the rest of us saw, one funded increasingly by money that wasn't his. He'd gotten into some bad investments in his late 20s, the specifics of which I only learned much later, and by his early 30s, he was quietly, steadily underwater in a way none of us had any idea about, because Ryan had also always been extremely good at making sure other people never saw the parts of his life that weren't working. The discrepancies started small enough that I almost didn't notice them, the way these things usually do, a handful of dollars here and there in the register reconciliation, easy enough to attribute to a cashier's honest mistake or a miscounted drawer. I flagged them anyway, because flagging small discrepancies is exactly what good inventory management requires, and for the first few months, that's all it was, a line item in my weekly reports that I noted and moved past. By the following spring, the discrepancies had grown from dollars into hundreds, and then, within a matter of a few months, into thousands, money that should have been in the store's accounts and simply wasn't, alongside inventory that had been ordered and paid for but never actually arrived on the shelves. I brought it to my father directly, the way I'd bring any operational concern to him, laying out the numbers across 2 years of records, and I remember him going quiet in the specific way he did when something worried him more than he wanted to admit out loud. We agreed, together, that I would start tightening the store's financial controls, restricting who had authorization to move money or approve vendor payments, tracking everything more closely than we ever had before. I didn't know, when I made that decision, that I was closing a door Ryan had been quietly walking through for the better part of a year. I didn't know, because it genuinely never occurred to me, in the specific, foolish way it doesn't occur to you that the person closest to you might be the explanation for the thing you're trying to solve. I was looking at vendors, at cashiers, at possible external fraud. I was not looking at my brother, because looking at my brother wasn't a category that existed in my mind at all. The tighter controls worked, in the sense that the discrepancies slowed dramatically within a few months of the new system going into place. What I didn't understand yet was that they'd slowed because Ryan had been forced to find a new way in, and the new way he found was me. I want to walk you through exactly how it happened, because the mechanics of it matter to understanding what came later. Our store's financial software required a manager-level login to approve vendor payments and authorize inventory write-offs, and mine was one of only 2 logins with that level of access, the other belonging to my father, who by that point had mostly stepped back from day-to-day operations and rarely touched the system directly. Ryan had access to the back office at both locations, including the original store where my desk was, and he knew, the way anyone who'd worked alongside me for years would know, that I frequently left my computer logged in during the day, running reports, stepping away to handle the floor, trusting the physical security of a family business the same uncomplicated way I trusted the people inside it. Over a period of roughly 4 months, using access he was never supposed to have and a login that was never his, Ryan began quietly diverting money through a combination of falsified vendor invoices and inventory write-offs, small enough individually to avoid immediate suspicion, but adding up, over that stretch, to just over $62,000. Every single transaction, in the system's records, was logged under my credentials. Every approval bore my digital signature. To anyone looking at the records cold, without any context beyond the data itself, it looked exactly like what Ryan needed it to look like, a trusted employee with high-level access, quietly and steadily embezzling from her own family's business. The way it unraveled happened fast, in the specific, disorienting way these things sometimes do once they finally surface, after months of building slowly underneath the surface of ordinary life. My father, doing a routine year-end review with our accountant, found the pattern almost immediately once he actually sat down and looked closely, the same way I had found the earlier, smaller discrepancies months before. Except this time, the transactions all traced back to my login, my approvals, my digital fingerprints on every single one of them. I remember the exact moment my father called me into his office, because I walked in expecting to discuss quarterly ordering, and instead found him sitting behind his desk with a printed stack of transaction records and an expression on his face I had never seen him wear in my life, somewhere between grief and disbelief. He slid the papers across the desk and asked me, quietly, to explain them. I looked at transactions I had never made, approvals I had never given, and for a long, disorienting moment, I genuinely could not process what I was looking at, because nothing about it made any sense. I told him the truth, which was that I had no idea what any of it was, that I had never authorized these payments, never approved these write-offs, and that someone else had clearly used my login to do this. I watched my father's face while I said it, and I understood, with a sinking, physical kind of dread, that he didn't fully believe me, not because he thought I was lying maliciously, but because the alternative explanation, that someone had deliberately impersonated me inside our own family's business, felt, in that moment, more far-fetched to him than the possibility that I'd simply made some catastrophic, uncharacteristic mistake and was now panicking under the weight of it. Ryan was in the store that day too, and I remember, with a clarity that has never left me, the specific way he inserted himself into that conversation, not as a suspect defending himself, but as a devastated brother trying to help make sense of something senseless. He sat with us. He asked careful, pointed questions about the timeline of the transactions, questions that, I understand now, weren't actually questions at all, but a performance of concern designed to steer the conversation exactly where he needed it to go. He suggested, gently, almost reluctantly, that maybe I'd been under more financial pressure than any of us realized, that maybe there was an explanation none of us wanted to consider. He never once said, directly, that he thought I'd done it. He simply made enough room in the conversation for everyone else to arrive at that conclusion on their own, which, I would learn later, was exactly the kind of quiet, deniable manipulation Ryan had always been extremely good at. My father brought in a lawyer within the week, and the lawyer, reviewing the same transaction logs, told him plainly that the pattern of activity, all tied to a single login with sole authorization, painted an extremely difficult picture to explain away, especially once combined with something I didn't find out about until later, that a portion of the diverted funds had been traced to a personal account that, on paper, according to records Ryan had apparently helped assist the lawyers. Investigator in locating, appeared to loosely connect back to me through a joint account I'd once shared with an ex-boyfriend years earlier and had genuinely forgotten still technically existed. I want to be honest with you about how quickly the ground disappeared from underneath me. Within 3 weeks, my father, acting on his lawyer's advice and what he described to me, through tears, as the worst decision of his life, filed a police report. Within 6 weeks, I was formally charged with embezzlement. And within 4 months, standing in a courtroom I never imagined I'd ever have a reason to be inside, I watched my own brother sit in the gallery, dabbing at his eyes, while the prosecution built a case against me almost entirely out of evidence he had quietly, carefully helped construct. If you've ever had someone you trusted completely stand by and let a lie about you take root because speaking the truth would have cost them something, hit subscribe to Calm Stories time right now, because I promise you, what happens 6 years later is exactly the kind of ending stories like this one deserve. I didn't go to prison. I want to say that clearly, because I know some of you are bracing for it, and the truth, while still devastating, wasn't quite that. My lawyer, a tired but genuinely capable public defender I was assigned after our family's savings had already been drained by the initial legal fees, managed to negotiate the charge down, arguing successfully that the case, while damning on paper, rested entirely on circumstantial digital evidence with no direct proof I had personally been the one at the keyboard. I accepted a plea to a lesser charge, a decision I still, to this day, have complicated feelings about, because accepting it meant accepting a criminal record for something I hadn't done, in exchange for avoiding the far worse outcome my lawyer genuinely believed a trial risked. I received probation, restitution I couldn't remotely afford, and a record that would follow me into every background check for the rest of my working life. What the plea didn't do, what nothing did, was convince my family. My father, in the aftermath, existed in a strange, unbearable limbo, unable to fully believe I'd done it, unable to fully believe I hadn't, caught in the specific paralysis of a parent who has been handed evidence he doesn't want to trust and a daughter he doesn't want to doubt, with no way to reconcile the two. My mother, who had passed away 3 years before any of this happened, wasn't there to see any of it, and I remember thinking, in my lowest moments during that stretch, that it was the only mercy in the entire situation. Ryan, throughout all of it, positioned himself as the family's steady center, the one who stepped up, who took over more of the store's day-to-day operations while everything else fell apart, who comforted my father, who, in the specific, quietly self-serving way I understand now but couldn't see then, made himself indispensable to a business that had briefly, catastrophically, been destabilized by a crisis he himself had manufactured. I was let go from the store immediately, obviously, and asked, by my father, gently but unmistakably, to stay away from both locations while things settled. They never settled. I spent the following 2 years essentially unemployable in any role requiring financial trust, applying to jobs that inevitably ran a background check and just as inevitably went quiet afterward, watching relationships with extended family thin out the way they do when nobody wants to be the one who picks a side. I moved briefly back in with a college friend, took whatever work I could find that didn't require a clean record, and spent most nights doing something I couldn't fully explain to anyone, teaching myself, methodically, obsessively, everything I could about how digital financial systems actually work, how login credentials get logged, how access trails get built, how someone could, theoretically, construct exactly the kind of evidence that had been used against me. I told myself, at the time, that I was just trying to understand what had happened to me. Looking back, I think some quieter part of me already suspected I'd need that knowledge again someday. I want to talk about the 2 years that followed, because I think the quiet, unglamorous rebuilding matters just as much to this story as anything that happened before or after it. I enrolled in a community college digital forensics certificate program using student loans I genuinely wasn't sure I'd ever be able to pay back, the kind of decision that made no obvious financial sense for someone in my position, but that felt, at the time, like the only thing left that was entirely mine to control. I studied evidence chains, metadata, the specific forensic methods investigators use to determine not just what happened inside a digital system, but who was actually behind the keyboard when it did. I finished the program, then a second, more advanced certification, and eventually landed an entry-level position at a small digital forensics and cybersecurity consulting firm that specialized, ironically, in exactly the kind of internal fraud investigations that had once nearly destroyed my life, except this time from the other side of the desk. I didn't take the job because of some poetic sense of justice. I took it because it was the only field where my specific, hard-won expertise actually meant something, and because, if I'm being fully honest, some part of me needed to understand, professionally and completely, how easily a person's entire life could be rewritten by evidence nobody had bothered to examine closely enough. I was good at the work, in the same quiet, methodical way I'd once been good at running Bennett's Hardware's books, and over the following 3 years, I built an entirely new professional identity out of the wreckage of the old one, the way people sometimes do when the alternative to rebuilding is simply not existing anymore. I moved to a different city, about 2 hours from the town I grew up in, far enough to stop running into people who knew the old version of the story, close enough that I still, every so often, heard fragments of it secondhand. I heard, through an old family friend who'd stayed loosely in touch, that Ryan had taken over full operational control of Bennett's Hardware within about a year of everything happening, that my father, worn down by grief and age and the particular exhaustion of a family that had quietly broken in half, had stepped back almost entirely. I heard the second location had expanded into a third. I heard Ryan was doing well, was well liked in town, was, in the specific, painful phrase people used without any apparent awareness of how it landed, really holding the family together. I muted almost everything connected to that part of my life during those years, not out of denial, but out of the specific, deliberate self-preservation you learn when dwelling on something you have no power to change only deepens the wound. I built a life. I made new friends who knew me only as the careful, precise forensic analyst I'd become, with no context for the version of me that had once stood in a courtroom accepting a plea for something I hadn't done. I didn't forget. I want to be clear about that. I simply learned to carry it quietly, the way you learn to carry anything you can't yet do anything about. 6 years after that courtroom, almost to the month, my firm was brought in on an engagement that had nothing, on paper, to do with my family at all. A regional retail holding company had recently acquired a small chain of hardware and home goods stores across our part of the state, a fairly ordinary transaction in the current retail climate, and as part of the acquisition's standard IT transition, they'd hired my firm to conduct a full digital infrastructure audit of the acquired stores, migrating old records, assessing legacy security systems, and flagging anything that might pose a liability risk before final integration into the parent company's systems. I want to be completely honest with you about something, because I know exactly how this sounds. I did not choose this assignment. I did not know, when I was staffed on it, which stores were included in the acquisition. My firm handles dozens of engagements like this every year, and I was simply the analyst available and qualified for a routine legacy systems audit, the same as I'd been assigned to countless similar projects before it. It was on the second day of reviewing the acquisition store list, cross-referencing old server inventories against the addresses provided, that I saw it. Bennett's Hardware. All 3 locations. I sat with that for a long time before I told anyone. My stomach did the specific, hollow thing it does when a floor you didn't know was still there suddenly gives out beneath you, 6 years after you thought you'd already fallen as far as you could go. I did exactly what I'd been trained to do, and exactly what I would have done for any client whose name meant something to me personally. I disclosed the conflict immediately, in writing, to my engagement lead, explaining that the acquired business had previously been my family's company, that I had a significant unresolved personal history connected to it, and that I needed to be formally recused from any direct client interviews or negotiations involving that specific location, while remaining, with appropriate independent oversight, on the broader technical audit, where any findings connected to Bennett's would be reviewed and verified by a colleague rather than taken on my authority alone. My firm, to their credit, took the disclosure seriously and structured the engagement exactly the way it needed to be structured, assigning a senior colleague, David, to directly oversee anything touching Bennett specifically, while I continued the parts of the broader audit that had no direct connection to it. I want you to understand. The same way I needed my own father to understand 6 years earlier, that I did not go looking for a reason to revisit what had happened to me. The assignment had simply already landed on my desk, in a stack of 11 other acquired locations, waiting for someone qualified enough to actually look closely. It was David, 3 weeks into the audit, who found the server. Bennett's original location, the one my grandfather built, had, sometime around the period everything happened to me, upgraded its point-of-sale and security infrastructure, and in the process, an old backup server, one that had housed the store's legacy security camera footage from the years before the upgrade, had simply been disconnected, moved into a back storage closet, and, in the specific, mundane way old equipment gets forgotten rather than deliberately hidden, never properly decommissioned or wiped. It had been sitting there, powered down, untouched, for 6 years. David flagged it to me the way he'd flag any piece of legacy hardware discovered during a standard audit, as a routine item requiring assessment before the acquisition's IT team either wiped it for compliance or archived it, with no idea, at the time, what specifically was on it or what it might mean to me. I remember staring at his email for a long moment before responding, because some part of me already understood, with a kind of dread I hadn't felt in years, exactly what that server might contain. Given the conflict of interest already on record, I was not the one who accessed the drive. David handled the technical recovery himself, with a second independent colleague verifying every step of the process, exactly the kind of careful, documented chain of custody I would have insisted on for any client in our position, and doubly so for my own. What they found, once the drive was properly imaged and the footage recovered, was a partial but intact archive of security camera recordings from the store's back office and register area, spanning roughly the same 4-month window during which the fraudulent transactions had originally occurred. I was not in the room when David first reviewed it. I want to be clear about that, because I think the specific, deliberate distance I kept from that process matters. I received his findings the way I would receive any colleague's findings on a case I'd disclosed a conflict on, formally, in writing, after independent verification, rather than watching the footage unfold in real time myself. What the footage showed, across several separate incidents throughout that window, was Ryan alone in the back office after hours, on nights I had specific, documented reason to not have been in the building at all, seated at my workstation, using my still logged-in terminal to process the exact transactions that had eventually been used as evidence against me. In one particularly clear segment, time-stamped a little after 10 at night on a Tuesday, I remembered specifically because it was my birthday and I had been 45 minutes away at a dinner with friends who could account for every hour of my evening. The footage showed him accessing the vendor payment system, approving a transaction under my credentials, and then, with a kind of careless confidence that told you everything about how certain he'd been that nobody would ever look, glancing briefly at the security camera in the corner of the room before returning to the screen, apparently never once considering that the footage might survive somewhere he'd forgotten to check. David's findings went, through the exact same formal process any audit finding would follow, first to my firm's leadership, then, given the clear and serious nature of what had been uncovered, to outside legal counsel for guidance on our disclosure obligations. Because the footage constituted potential evidence in what had originally been a criminal case, one that had already resulted in a conviction, my firm's counsel determined that we had a legal and ethical obligation to formally notify the original prosecuting authority, through proper channels, of newly discovered evidence relevant to a closed case, regardless of the personal connection involved. I did not make that call myself. I could not have, both because of my formal recusal and because, I'll admit, some part of me genuinely did not trust myself to make it with the calm, procedural precision the moment required. My firm's general counsel handled the notification, and from that point forward, exactly as it had 6 years earlier when the case first began, the process moved forward through institutions with far more authority than I had ever personally possessed. If you've ever waited years for the truth to catch up to a lie that had already reshaped your entire life, go ahead and hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time now, because what happened over the following several months unfolded in a way I genuinely could not have predicted, even after everything I'd already learned about how slowly, and how completely, these things eventually surface. The footage, once formally submitted, triggered a reopened investigation, handled by a different detective than the one who'd originally arrested me, a fact I found, in a small, quiet way, easier to sit with than I expected. Forensic analysts, independent of my firm entirely, verified the authenticity of the recovered footage, confirmed the timestamps against the original store server logs, and cross-referenced the timeline against the original case file, the same file that had once been used to build a case against me with no direct proof anyone had actually been at the keyboard. This time, there was direct proof, and it wasn't mine. I learned, through the detective handling the reopened case rather than through the old, unreliable grapevine I'd once relied on, that once confronted with the footage, Ryan's account of events collapsed almost immediately. He'd apparently believed, for 6 years, that the original backup server had been wiped during the store's system upgrade, a detail nobody had ever specifically confirmed to him, and one that, it turned out, simply hadn't happened, through nothing more dramatic than an overworked IT contractor who'd moved the old hardware into storage rather than properly decommissioning it, never imagining that oversight would matter to anyone 6 years later. I was not present for Ryan's arrest, which happened at the original Bennett's hardware location on an ordinary Wednesday morning, according to the same family friend who'd once kept me loosely updated on everything I'd tried so hard to stop hearing about. My father was there. I've since learned, secondhand and still incompletely, that he stood in the store he'd handed his son the keys to and watched him get let out in handcuffs, in almost exactly the same doorway I'd once been let out of myself. I want to be honest about something, the same way I asked you to trust me earlier when I said I hadn't orchestrated any of it. I did not manufacture this outcome. I had no authority over the audit's timeline, no involvement in the server's discovery, no role whatsoever in Ryan's arrest beyond the same disclosure obligation any of us in this field are bound by. I did my job accurately, recused myself the moment a conflict existed, and let a system built for exactly this kind of situation do precisely what it was designed to do, 6 years later than any of us would have wanted, but not one day later than the truth actually needed. My original conviction, once the new evidence was formally entered into the record, became the subject of its own separate legal process, a post-conviction relief filing my new lawyer, a far more capable one than I'd been able to afford the first time around, moved through with a level of confidence I hadn't experienced inside a courtroom in 6 years. Within 4 months, the original charge against me was formally vacated, the plea withdrawn, my record, for the first time since I was 28 years old, genuinely clean. I want to talk about what it actually felt like, because I think the honest answer surprises people every time I tell this story. I did not feel triumphant when the charge was vacated. I sat in a courtroom, the same kind of courtroom that had once taken something enormous from me, and listened to a judge formally clear a record I'd carried for 6 years, and what I mostly felt was a strange, heavy exhaustion, the specific kind that comes after you've been vindicated in a way you spent so long believing might never actually arrive. My father called me the same evening, the first real conversation we'd had in nearly 5 years, and I want to tell you that it was a clean, healing moment, the kind these stories sometimes promise you at the end, but the truth is more complicated than that. He cried, for a long time, apologizing in a way that came 6 years too late to undo what those years had cost me, and I found myself, in that moment, feeling less anger than I expected and more a kind of tired, complicated grief for both of us, for the version of our family that had existed before any of this happened and that I don't think either of us fully believes we'll ever get back completely. I did go back to the town, eventually, a handful of times, mostly to help my father, who is older now and visibly worn down by everything, sort through what remains of Bennett's hardware, which he sold, quietly, about a year after Ryan's case concluded, unable to face running it alone and unwilling, understandably, to hand it to anyone else after everything that name had come to mean. I felt less about the sale than I expected to. Some things, once broken in a specific enough way, simply don't hold their old shape again, even once the truth about them is finally settled. Ryan's case moved through the courts over the following year, and he ultimately pled guilty to the original embezzlement charge alongside a related fraud charge for what the prosecution described as deliberately, knowingly framing another person for a crime he committed, a specific legal weight that hadn't existed the first time around, when everyone, including the system meant to protect me, had simply assumed the evidence spoke plainly enough on its own. He received a sentence considerably longer than the plea I'd once been pressured into accepting for something I never did, a fact I've thought about more than I expected to, not with satisfaction exactly, but with a kind of sober, complicated clarity about how unevenly consequences sometimes land, and how much of that unevenness simply comes down to who happens to look closely enough, and when. I have not spoken to him since his arrest, and I don't know, honestly, if I ever will. I've thought, the same way I once assumed I might feel some finality once I finally learned the truth about what happened to me, about what I would say if he ever wrote to me from wherever he ends up. I don't think I'm owed an apology in order to keep living the life I've rebuilt without him in it, and I've stopped, mostly, waiting for one. It's been just over a year now since the charge against me was formally vacated, and close to 2 since that forgotten server was found sitting in the back of a storage closet that almost got cleared out entirely before anyone thought to check what was on it. I still work in digital forensics, though I've since moved into a more senior role, specializing, somewhat inevitably, in exactly the kind of internal fraud and wrongful evidence cases that once nearly cost me everything. I don't take every case personally. I couldn't do this work if I did. But I understand, in a way very few of my colleagues do, exactly what's at stake for the person on the other side of a file like the one that was once built against me. I rebuilt my relationship with my father slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild anything that's been broken for a long time, in small, deliberate pieces rather than one clean gesture. We talk regularly now. We don't talk about Ryan much, and when we do, it's brief, careful, the way you handle something you both know could still cut either of you if you're not careful with it. I don't think either of us has fully forgiven what those 6 years cost us, individually or as a family, and I've come to believe that's a more honest place to sit than pretending otherwise. I've made a genuinely good life in the years since, slower to extend trust than I used to be, though I've come to see that less as a loss and more as a hard-earned kind of wisdom. I've learned, in a way I never had to before any of this happened, that the people closest to you are still, underneath everything, capable of choices you never saw coming, and that trust, real trust, isn't diminished by holding a few careful things back. It's protected by it. What I want to leave you with, more than the satisfaction of watching the truth eventually catch up to my brother, is this. I never once had to manufacture, exaggerate, or manipulate anything for that footage to surface. I disclosed exactly what I was obligated to disclose, recused myself the moment a conflict existed, and let a system that had once failed me completely finally have the chance to do what it was actually built to do. If you are carrying something right now that feels unfinished, a lie that got to stand because nobody looked closely enough, a truth that feels like it's been buried somewhere you can't reach it, I want you to hear me say that very few things stay buried forever. Sometimes it takes an old server nobody remembered to check. Sometimes it takes 6 years. But more often than you'd expect, it surfaces exactly when it needs to. I don't wish Ryan the worst version of what's ahead of him, even now, even after everything, and I think that surprises people when I say it out loud. What I wish, if I'm honest, is that he'd simply told the truth the day my father first laid those transaction records on the desk between us, instead of quietly letting a lie about his own sister take root because it was easier for him than the alternative. I would have forgiven almost anything he ever asked me to forgive, for most of my life. I never got the chance to say yes to that one, because he never gave me the chance to be asked. That's my story. 6 years carrying something I never did, a family that broke in ways I'm still learning to live around, and a truth that found its way to the surface on a server nobody thought to check, on a timeline I never controlled and never needed to. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever waited for the truth to catch up to a lie that outran it for far too long, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told, and I don't want you to miss the next one. I'll see you there.